So some of the problems you work on in your thought primer homework are going to involve arguments that look very similar to the arguments we've been exploring in other lectures in this thought primer. They're going to be arguments about things like snow and mail and dogs and pain. But some of the arguments that you're going to be working with don't look like that. They look more like this. These are arguments that are coming to you already symbolized, and you don't know what specific statements each of the letters in these arguments represents. But nonetheless, you're going to have to construct truth tables to determine whether or not these arguments are valid. Now, there's some things that people do in this part of the homework that causes them to get things wrong, and it can lead to a lot of frustration because they're taking all this time to create these truth tables and then having to go back and redo them over and over and over because they're making really simple errors, oversights. And what I want to do here is identify what some of those common mistakes are that lead to a lot of frustration so that you don't have a frustrating experience. All right, so the first thing to take note of is the form of these arguments that they're coming to you in. Okay, each of them is going to have a series of premises on top of an inference bar, and below that inference bar is going to be your conclusion. Okay, so you might think of this inference bar as the equivalent of the word therefore or consequently. So when you are representing these arguments in a truth table, you want to make sure that you are very carefully writing down the premises exactly as they appear in the original problem. This is one of the most common mistakes that people make. They'll forget to put a tilde on a letter. And then they construct this huge truth table, and the whole thing's off because of that stupid tilde that got let off. And then they have to go back, add the tilde in, and redo the entire truth table, okay? So make sure you're copying the premises and the conclusion statements very accurately into your truth table. Second thing to take note of, make sure you're separating each of your premise statements from other premises with that single slash. That's going to prevent you from making calculation errors and mistaking where one premise begins and another ends. Make sure, too, this is going to become really important next week, that you separate your conclusion from the final premise with the double slash. Okay? All right. Next, make sure that you take note of where individual letters appear multiple times. So K appears 4 times in this argument, and you want to take careful note of that because when you're determining the truth values for K, those truth values have to match every time K appears because each line in the truth table is a particular moment in time, and an individual statement, in this case K, can't be both true and false at the same time. So on each line, the truth values for K has to be consistent, and that's the same for all of the other letters. And you're going to find that some of these problems you're working with, there'll be arguments that involve multiple appearances of the same letter. All right, next thing to take note of. Remember that tildes become the operator you're concerned with when they operate on a letter, okay? So we have tilde L, horseshoe, tilde M here, and the truth value of the main operator of this statement, horseshoe, is going to be determined by the tildes, not by the truth value of L or M. Make sure also that you remember that when tilde appears outside of parentheses, it does not distribute to the terms inside parentheses. So the truth value of tilde is going to be determined by the truth value of this wedge. The tilde operates on the operator inside parentheses. So when you're marking tildes outside of parentheses, you're concerned with the truth value of the operator in parentheses, here the wedge, not K or L. All right. Next, make sure you're really clear where your main operators are, where the columns for your main operators are, okay? I would recommend doing something like highlighting the main operators for each of your premise and conclusion statements. That way, when you go to evaluate your truth table, and some of them are going to have 8 lines in them, that way when you go to evaluate your truth table, it's really easy among all of those T's and F's that are scattered all over your truth table to identify which is the main operator, which truth values matter the most. When you've completed all of the truth values for your truth table, you want to concern yourself only with the lines in your truth table where the conclusion is false, okay? A lot of people get tripped up and they start looking like, oh my gosh, here's this argument that's got false premises and it leads to a true conclusion. That must be an invalid argument. No. You want to concern yourself only with those lines in your truth table where the conclusion statement has a value of false under its main operator. Because what you want to know is, on those lines where the main operator for the conclusion is false, did any of them have all of the premise statements marked as true? If not, as the case here is, we see we've got lines 1, 5, and 6 are all false. But on each one of those lines, there's at least one premise that's false. And that tells us this argument is valid. Okay? But if we had a line where the conclusion was false and all of the premises were true, that proves the argument to be invalid. And remember, when you're doing your work, anytime you discover that an argument is invalid, you're always going to identify the line or the lines that prove it invalid. All right? So keep those tips in mind as you do your homework, and you're going to do a great job. I just know it.